So I recently finished Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and overall I enjoyed the game quite a bit. It definitely has some flaws, but considering that I played the original Shin Megami Tensei 5 on the Switch and ended up dropping it partway through, this game in my opinion is a huge improvement. If anyone were to ask me which version they should play, I would 100% of the time say play Vengeance. There are practically no downsides to it. In a similar vein, I would also recommend Persona 5 Royal, Persona 4 Golden, even Catherine Full Body. Basically, I would recommend the Atlus Definitive Editions over the originals for any relatively recent Atlus game that I can think of. And you don't have to take my word for it either. If you compare any of these games against their originals on Metacritic or OpenCritic, you will find that the critics also generally recommend the Definitive Editions over the original. On OpenCritic, Royal actually scores the same as Persona, but Persona 5 was already so highly rated there that there wasn't a lot of room to go up anyway. There are also the user scores of Royal on Metacritic, which is actually lower than the original, but based on some light reading and knowledge of the fanbase, I actually think there is an explanation for this. You see, the Definitive Editions are probably one of the most hated business practices that Atlus has by the community. There are a lot of reasons for this, and I know most people clicking on this video probably came in with some idea or preconception about these Definitive Editions. Now, if you don't know what an Atlus Definitive Edition is, basically Atlus has a history of taking their mainline games, that being Persona, Shin Megami Tensei, and even Catherine, and after a few years, re-releasing an updated version that also has upgrades throughout the game. Now, because it is a re-release, Atlus also charges full price for the game. And so anytime I say Definitive Edition or re-release, I'm specifically referring to this practice by Atlus. So why is it exactly that Atlus Definitive Edition scores so well critically, but it's also so hated by the community? Well, let's take a closer look at both sides of this dichotomy and try to find an answer to the question. Are Atlus Definitive Editions overrated or overhated? Now, before we get started on the video, I just want to let you know I am going to spoil the crap out of Persona 5 Royal and Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. You have been warned. So let's start by taking a look at why these games are so well rated. Honestly, I think there's a very simple answer here. That answer is that the re-releases are just expanded versions of relatively recent games, and so it almost gives a floor for what the rating could be. The new versions just add to and improve content throughout the game, like dungeons, characters, and mechanics. So when a reviewer is writing their review, they have two options to consider. Do they rate the game solely on the added content, trying to ignore all of the elements of the base game, or do they look at the game on the whole and give a score based on the merits of the entire game, including the elements of the base game? When faced with a branching path, I think for most reviewers, the decision is a simple one. You review the game as a whole. Now, the reason for this are twofold. First, differentiating between new content and old content can be extremely challenging. As an example, Persona 5 Royal expanded upon a lot of the palaces that already exist in the base game. These expansions took the form of new rooms, but also modifications of existing rooms by adding the use of a grappling hook or a similar pathway modification. So when trying to separate the new from the old, do you just include the entire palace at that point, since almost every element was touched in some way? Or do you somehow try to quantify how much fun the grappling hook added to the palace exploration, without considering how fun the palaces were in the first place? Similarly, almost every Confidant has had something changed. For instance, now after every Confidant event, the Confidant will call the main character and there will be a little extra piece of dialogue. Do you evaluate the Confidant solely based on the added lines of text, choosing to ignore the context around it? And you don't even have to take my word for it. In the description of this video, I have linked the video of another content creator, Screenmints. In that video, he goes over the differences between P5 Vanilla and Royal. The video itself only goes up through the first major palace, and it's still nearly an hour and a half long. If he goes one arc at a time, there will be at least 7 videos. And so hopefully that tells you that there are a lot of changes, small and large, between the two. The second reason a reviewer might choose to review the whole product is that really that is what the person is buying. So when you're writing the review, I think you almost have to assume that you're talking to a new buyer, or at the very least, the person that's reading your review and considering buying the game is looking to buy the whole experience. Rating a game purely on added content wouldn't be useful for a person who hasn't played a Persona game. Meanwhile, including the vanilla content in the review doesn't really hurt people who've already played the game, since they can probably read the review and determine if the added content is worth a replay. So why would a reviewer limit their audience by limiting the extent of their review? And so with those two factors in mind, I think it makes a lot of sense that reviewers reviewed the game on the whole. So since re-release games can't be separated the same way, it tends to lead to inflation of the review score, since it is most likely that so long as the added content is good, the reviewer will give at least the same, if not a higher review score to indicate that they like this re-released version more than the base version. The most they would likely do in a review is try to explain what the added content is and whether or not they think it's worth spending an extra $60 or $70 if you played the original game. Now let's compare these re-releases to the more standard industry practice of DLC. Generally speaking, major DLC is added content almost entirely separated from the base game. For most games, if it is a major piece of DLC, the developers will usually make the content available to people who have already started playing the game and have a save file. Because of this, the content they add is quite literally separated from the base game. This means that the critics can be, well, a little more critical. Now they can judge the added content not just on how good the whole game is, but specifically what the DLC adds to the game. I think a great recent example of this is the Elden Ring DLC. The DLC was received pretty well critically, but the general gaming audience has been specifically critical of it. Now, most people who don't like the DLC, I would still think would recommend playing the base Elden Ring game. I mean, they enjoyed the base game enough to even purchase and play the DLC. So the players can very easily distinguish between the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC and the base game and make recommendations and also scores accordingly. So all this is to say that compared to the standard industry practice of adding DLC, obviously re-release games do have what I would call an inflated review score, because reviewers basically have to take into account the base game on top of the DLC. So now with that said, let's take a look at the other side for a second and let me play devil's advocate. And now I know what I'm about to say is somewhat controversial, but please don't get mad at me, and that is that I actually think that Atlus re-releases are not that much different than remakes. Modern remakes, and I do mean true remakes, not like Final Fantasy VII remakes, tend to be old, very good games remade in a new engine, but that follow the original game almost scene for scene. There's usually some slight changes, usually to help modernize it so it will sell well to modern audiences, but overall the ultimate goal of the project is to resell the original game with a new coat of paint. I would say that this practice also games the review industry, in much the same way that an Atlus re-release does. So long as the developers take care to update the design decisions from 2004 to acceptable design decisions in 2024, it's basically guaranteed to review well. I mean, who would have thought that a good game in 2004 is still a good game today? With that said, I don't see nearly the amount of hatred and vitriol aimed towards remakes, especially if they're remaking a game that a person is nostalgic of. And I mean, I get it. Nostalgia is one hell of a drug, and there are games that I'm nostalgic of too. Plus, there's also a huge difference between a game that released 20 years ago, getting a modern version that's playable on modern hardware, and a 3-year-old game you still have a console for. But ultimately, if we're trying to determine if the re-release games are overrated, I think I would also have to argue that remakes are at least somewhat overrated too. I mean, when Resident Evil 4 Remake released, people were campaigning for it to be Game of the Year. I would argue that no remake should be Game of the Year purely because it would just become a cheat code to win awards. Nintendo could just remake Ocarina of Time. Rockstar could remake San Andreas. 2K could remake BioShock. BioWare could remake Dragon Age Origins or Mass Effect. The list goes on. And sure, these would all be good games, and I would actually like to play most of them, you know, assuming the devs didn't drop the ball, but they would all be based on a winning formula, made for them years ago by their predecessors. So, is that really so different than re-releasing a good game from 3 years ago? If so, then where's the line? Does it have to be on last gen or older hardware? I mean, most of the Atlus re-releases are actually on new consoles. Shin Megami Tensei 5 was only on the Switch and ran like crap. But now, when Atlus released Vengence, the game also released on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. So since it was brought to new consoles, would that give it a pass? These questions, of course, are rhetorical, and honestly, it's kind of a question that every person has a different answer to, but there does have to be a line somewhere, right? A line where a re-release suddenly becomes acceptable. And I think that maybe we should all try to evaluate where that line is for us. So, in summary, yes, the way that Atlus handles the re-releases quite literally leads to them being overrated, since they basically game the reviewing system by repackaging the original product with a newer, shinier shell. But like I said, is that really so different than the general gaming industry at this point? Would it be better for companies to make new games and new IP and take more risks? Yeah, I think so. I'm sure most of you do too. But I also think I can't really fault Atlus that much either, given the current gaming landscape. And I'm sure depending on where that line is for you, you may or may not find Atlus re-releases acceptable. And I'm not saying this as if it totally invalidates the criticism. I'm mostly just arguing that what they're doing isn't that uncommon in the gaming system, and there are other games that I think should be under the same scrutiny that I generally think aren't. But of course, that can't be the end of the discussion. There's also the other half of the question I originally posed. Are the Atlus re-releases overhated? And so I think most of the hate of these re-releases are from people perceiving the practice as greedy. which I totally understand. So to fully analyze this, I think we have to compare this practice against the standard industry practice of DLC. As I talked about earlier, conventional DLC is bound to be an addition to the base game, which is to say it almost always exists as a standalone experience separate from the base game. When comparing this against Atlus re-releases, you'll notice that the re-releases allow for content to be added and sprinkled throughout the game. Since it's a re-release, it forces players to replay the game from the start since they don't have an existing save file. And so by extension, it presents a value to Atlus to try to fix a lot of the problems in the base game for the new players. For example, in Vengence, they added these rails to all of the maps, which are basically shortcuts cutting down on backtracking time. They also allow the player to save anywhere, meaning that you don't have to teleport back to the save point to save and then run back to where you just were to fight the boss. You can now just save and go and fight the boss. Of course, they also added new demons, new quests, new parry-up, which unlock new Magatsui moves. And all of these changes exist in the base game, not just the new Vengeance campaign. You can also look at Royal, where not only did they make gameplay changes like all of Kichijoji, but they also added new characters that show up throughout the story, making them feel more involved and less tacked on than previous installments. I mean, imagine if Maruki just randomly showed up after you killed God without the context of the confidant that you had already completed. They also reworked Akechi and made him a much more compelling character before bringing him back in Maruki's dream world. Now, without doing a full re-release of the game, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to tell a story that they did in Royal in the same impactful way. Of course, you can still argue that they could still force players to do a full replay of a game for DLC, so let's ignore how unpopular that would probably be and just consider that hypothetical. If Atlus took Royal and split it up into different DLCs that you could buy one at a time, or maybe as a season pass, let's kind of take a look at what those DLCs might be. If Atlus split Royal up into separate DLCs, I would expect that the third semester might be one large DLC, Kichijoji might be another, Will Seeds and Dungeon Redesigns another, Mementos upgrades, Confidants upgrades yet another. And so by the time you list out all of the major and minor upgrades Persona 5 Royal made over vanilla Persona 5, you honestly have nearly a dozen DLCs. Even if every DLC cost $10 to $25, or even if they made 4 season passes, you would still pay more than the $60 or $70 it costs to buy the game again. So at that point, it kind of defeats the argument that the re-release versions are greedy, as I think you could certainly argue that breaking everything down into DLC is probably greedier. Now, of course, that's only looking at it purely from the value perspective. By making that argument, I'm assuming that the consumer is going to buy all of the DLC possible when it comes out. So what if you don't have the money or don't have the desire to play all of the DLC they offer? For instance, what if you wanted to play the third semester DLC for $30 but didn't want to buy Kichijoji for $15? In Persona 5 Royal, you don't have the choice. So there is a chance that in a DLC format, you would spend less money and be able to experience what it is that you want to experience. And so from that perspective, it takes away customer agency and potentially prices people out of the added content that they want to play. You can also make the point that Persona and SMT already have DLC. Now, I would have to point out that the DLC that does exist tends to be the new optional boss fights and cosmetics. Since cosmetics have no impact on gameplay, I'm just going to set them aside since I don't really think they fit into the same box that we're talking about. Not including optional boss fights though, I do think is a little greedy from Atlus when they aren't included in the definitive edition. But to be fair, when I bought Vengence on PC, I didn't even realize, but it came with the optional boss DLC for free as part of it. And also, while it would be nice to have them include all of the DLC, I don't think that optional bosses represent a core change to the game like the changes that were made in Royal. They're just nice things to have if you enjoy the combat. So yeah, it is a little greedy, but I would at least argue that it isn't horrible. Of course, there are other reasons to be mad at the practice beyond greed. I just think greed is the most common reason. So for the sake of completeness, I want to mention a few other reasons. The first reason that I see people claim a lot when talking about the re-release practice and why they hate it is that they think the original game releases are purposely unfinished and that these re-releases are just a way for Atlus to make more money by reselling a game that they should have made in the first place. Now, I just want to be very clear when I say this. I believe that this take is just flat out wrong, and I think there are 4 main points that I can make against this claim. First, a developer has no way of knowing what issues a game might have before release. As an example, maybe during the Persona 5 development, they didn't realize that having Morgana tell you to go to bed every night after a dungeon would be as annoying as it was. That's the kind of thing that I can tell the devs made to try to balance going into the dungeons by making it more punishing on the social sim side of things. Since that was a decision they made in the hopes of balancing, I could totally see how it was a blind spot for them. And that's just one example in a sea of similar changes made to Persona 5 Royal. The second reason is that there's also the reality that developers have limited budgets and limited time constraints. Games like SMT5 may have released unfinished in the eyes of many, and maybe even in the eyes of the developers. But the reality is you have to ship the product at some point, and you can't just keep spending money on a game that might not ultimately sell well anyway. Steam Early Access is littered with the corpses and zombies of games that developers wanted to spend more time and more money on without ever reaching their end goal. Budgets and scopes exist and have to be worked around. That is part of what it means to be a developer, and is also core to making a good game that isn't just bloated with every concept the dev could throw at it. The practice of re-releasing gives the developer the budget to make the changes that they may have wanted to make since the beginning, but that doesn't mean that they purposefully omitted that content at the beginning. The third reason, which ties into the second, is that just because a game is bad or underwhelming doesn't mean that it is unfinished. I think you can look at every single game that has ever been made or released and point out things that you'd want to improve. Sure, in some games you might see more problems than others, but let's leave the Atlus world for a second and look at one of the highest rated games of all time, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. When this game released in 2017, it was considered a masterpiece. I mean, it even won Game of the Year in many awards shows, including the Game Awards. Then, lo and behold, in 2023, Nintendo released Tears of the Kingdom. And sure, it added a lot of content and mechanics, much like what a re-release does, but it fundamentally used a lot of the ideas and assets from Breath of the Wild. And in many people's eyes, it was just Breath of the Wild plus. And so this literally award-winning game was reanalyzed by the developers and improved upon, proving that even masterpieces can be reevaluated and improved. The fourth and final reason, which is more specific to Atlus, is that many of the re-release games recently don't even have the original developers working on it. Persona 5 Royal is made by P Studio after Hashino left to work at Studio Zero on Metaphor. So really it was made by the devs that are currently working on Persona 6, not the original developers. Also, Studio Zero, the studio that Hashino's now at, made the changes to Catherine Fullbody. And while Hashino was behind the original Catherine, not everyone on the new team was. So these changes and updates couldn't have been originally imagined during their initial release. This proves beyond a doubt, for at least these two games, the devs didn't purposefully exclude any content to resell later. Instead, both of these games were most likely used for internal training for new hires who were brought on to flesh out the two teams that had just reformed. Now, are some things left on the cutting room floor that could have been good? Sure, people have data mined a lot of information in Persona 5, and we have seen a lot of the stuff that was cut. But there's a big gap between could have been good and would have been good. And saying that something would have been good goes so deep into speculation territory and personal bias that I don't even think is worth considering. So with that argument out of the way, let's look at some other reasons that I think are a little more compelling. There's the argument that maybe Atlus should just make the re-release versions an upgrade to the existing game. That is to say that a person new to the franchise can buy Persona 5 Royal at full price, but maybe someone who bought vanilla P5 can pay $30 to get all of the Royal upgrades. Now, this argument is obviously the best possible outcome for the consumer, and so obviously I support this idea. However, I do think there are two arguments that can be made here. First, and this is me playing devil's advocate, as I said earlier, the amount of content they have been adding to these games far surpasses the amount of added content normally found in a $30 DLC. So, as I said earlier, if Atlus priced out all of the changes they made to Persona 5 or SMT5 Vengence as normal DLC, it would almost certainly cost more than $60 or even $70. So, if that's the case, why would Atlus ever sell everything for $30? Now, if Atlus was pushed in this direction, I'm almost positive we would see a reduction in the amount of content changed in the re-released versions, purely because there wouldn't be that much money in it. The second reason is that many of these re-releases also coincide with ports to other platforms or graphical updates that make them unavailable on previously available platforms. In the case of P5, PlayStation 3 support was dropped when Royal released since devs had upgraded the character models and textures. So that would mean if you originally bought Persona 5 on the PlayStation 3, you would be SOL, and you would just have to rebuy the game on PS4 as there's no way to link the two platforms. Also in SMT5 Vengeance, I played the original on Switch, but obviously I wasn't about to buy Vengence there, so I bought it on PC. Now, how would that work logistically? There's no way to link my Nintendo account to my Steam account. And so while I wish the consumer won and that it just turned into a $30 upgrade, the reality is it just never will, because it doesn't make sense economically. Another argument that I actually think is very strong is the fact that these games are extremely long by video game standards. For me, I think I beat Persona 5 in about 80 hours and Persona 5 Royal in something like 100 hours. hours. Needless to say that is a massive amount of time. Because of this, for a lot of people, there's a feeling of burnout that accumulates when you're replaying a 100-hour game after 3 years. And it's really a big risk for Atlus. Maybe if there were a bigger gap between the initial release and the re-release, this would be less of an issue. But it is for sure an issue for people who love the game and just want to enjoy the new re-releases, but can't because they just get burnt out on it. Frankly, I don't see a way that Atlus could get around this other than just moving to a DLC model where you can just pick up an old save that you have. Alternatively, they could just wait longer periods, like I kind of mentioned, between the release and re-release so people are more willing to replay. But it's an unfortunate reality for the people who it does really bother. Thankfully, I still enjoyed Royal, I still enjoyed Vengeance, but I could definitely see where people could get burnt out on it. And finally, there is also the argument in reality that since the re-releases are consistently only a couple years after the original, people will just wait until the inevitable re-release comes. And this is true. In many ways, Atlus is probably hurting their own sales of the original game by consistently re-releasing their own games so close to one another. Now, personally, I valued the experience of playing the game 2 or 3 years sooner and repurchasing the final version more than I value the $70 I'd save by waiting. But for many people, if they aren't super excited to play the game, or if they don't have the money, why not wait? Again, the only way I can really see fixing this is by making a bigger gap between the initial release and the re-release. And so those are, I think, a summary of most of the arguments I see against the practice of re-releasing and why it is so hated. I also think there's another argument that you can make against me in this video, which is that most of my examples for re-releases have recency bias. So far, I've really only talked about Catherine Full Body, P5 Royal, and SMT5 Vengeance, which all re-released in the past few years. If you go back in time, Persona 4 Golden did tweak some of the gameplay elements, but really the added content is mostly entirely separate from the base game, except for one confidant. And I know there are a lot of minor changes, kind of like with Royal, but they aren't nearly as far-reaching as they are in P5 Royal. So in the case of Golden, there is a much stronger argument for making the re-releases DLC instead. Now, with that said, I also think we should be putting more weight on the more recent re-releases, since I think that it stands to reason that any potential future re-releases would be closer to the modern ones. Speaking of the future, where does that leave us? Well, I think like many things in life, the real answer to the question is it's complicated. You can argue that the games are literally overrated by default. You can also argue that pretty much any remake is too. You can argue that the practice is greedy, but if you broke down all the changes into separate DLC content, it would almost certainly cost more than just rebuying the game. Then again, packaging all the DLC into one non-negotiable package takes agency away from the customers and potentially prices people out from playing some DLC that they might have wanted to play. You can argue that it should be an upgrade, but then why would Atlus do that when they can just make more money by changing to the industry standard of DLC? And so really, I think there's a lot of nuance here, and that everyone's opinion will differ slightly. In my personal opinion, I enjoy the way that Atlus does definitive editions. It gives me a reason to replay a game that I've already loved, while also giving me some new experiences to be excited for. And so I personally don't feel burnt out playing the game because of all these small changes. It allows for DLC to extend beyond simple add-ons that are totally separate from the base game. I mean, Maruki is probably my favorite villain in Persona, and he just couldn't exist the way he does if Atlus just did standard DLC. And I personally love most of the changes in Royal and Vengeance. And sure, I don't love every change that they make. I mean, some of the changes are for the worse. But I would say overall, they add enough value and make enough changes to make it worth it for me. And as I stated earlier, I would unequivocally recommend people new to either series just play the re-released versions. Of course, this is also coming from my perspective, where money isn't super tight and I can afford to pick up both copies without really thinking much about it. But even if I try to take into account the money, I still think there's enough value added in the re-released versions, for me anyway. I mean, it turned Shin Megami Tensei 5 from a game I didn't finish to one that I would actually probably recommend with Vengeance. Persona 5 Royal, as I mentioned earlier, added enough content to basically fill up at least 2 DLC passes, which would cost the same amount as the full game. And that's not even getting into the fact that I like the concept of the re-releases because it incentivizes the developer to make new content to the base game. Not everything is stuck in this separate DLC, which is its own self-contained story and world. The interesting thing though is supposedly SMT5 Vengeance will be the last re-release version of any Atlus game, at least for the foreseeable future. You see, rumor has it Sega, Atlus's parent company, is basically forcing Atlus to start to develop DLC instead of definitive editions. This would mean that Metaphor ReFantazio would likely have a DLC pass like the Persona 3 Reload DLC pass. Now, only time will tell if these rumors are true, and while I personally think that the DLC they will offer will probably be less compelling than a full re-release, I won't know for sure until I play it. Plus, I know for many people this is good news and the direction they want Atlus to go. And so, assuming the rumor is true, I guess we will find out for ourselves if Atlus definitive editions are truly overrated or if they're overhated. Thank you if you made it all the way through the video. I know that this video will likely be contentious in the community, as I'm not sure if I've ever seen anyone else voice support for the re-releases that Atlus makes. So, I understand that I'm the weird one here, but I at least think that there is a bit more of a discussion here than just universally hating this practice, because I do think there are some benefits. Whether or not it's enough benefits to you to outweigh the negatives, that's totally up to you, and I get that. And in fact, in this video, I'm sure there's some points that I missed that you could bring up in the comments. And I do encourage discussing this, and I will try to respond to any questions as I see them. I just ask that you be respectful of both my opinion and others. At the end of the day, we're talking about how a video game company publishes their games. It really isn't that important in the grand scheme of things. So let's keep it civil and rational. Besides that, if you like this video, leave a like. I have another video going over Atlus's upcoming release, Metaphor ReFantazio, that you can go check out. I also plan on making more videos about RPGs, but as I mentioned in my last video, I don't really have as much time as I used to, so my pace will be fairly relaxed. So if you do want to see more videos from me going forward, feel free to subscribe. That way you don't have to rely on the algorithm picking up on my video. Now, after all that, once again, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.